The Yeti, also known as Snowmen, are legendary creatures that are believed by locals to inhabit high mountains, including Tibet. The Yeti are described as huge creatures with fur-covered bodies, large paws, and large heads. They are considered wild and ferocious creatures capable of cruel acts. According to legend, Bigfoot avoid contact with humans and prefer to live in remote and snowy areas to be safe from human interference. Their behavior is described as ruthless and aggressive. They are considered predators and can attack both animals and humans if they enter their territory. According to the terrifying legends, Bigfoot have become known for their brutal attacks on humans. They attack careless travelers who enter their territory with ruthless fury. The murders committed by Bigfoot are shrouded in mystery and horror, as they are capable of exterminating humans without a trace. Their sharp claws and immense strength make them dangerous predators who feed on human meat and stop at nothing to satisfy their bloodlust. Survivors of Bigfoot attacks describe them as death, coming in the form of a savage and indomitable creature that does not distinguish between good and evil, only hungry for destruction. One of the victims told us about Bigfoot. Bigfoot are creepy creatures, disfigured and covered in fur, with huge red eyes mottled with rage and bloodlust. Their intimidating paws are dotted with sharp claws that can tear a body apart in seconds. Their huge black teeth gleam in the darkness, ready to devour their victims with vivid speed. Their enormous bodies emit a stinking odor that makes humans feel death approaching. Ferocious animals, they stalk their victims with dead certainty, bringing with them ruthless destruction and chaos. Their rage has no bounds, their bloodlust will not settle until complete annihilation is achieved. They are the darkness that has come to the living world to spread fear and terror, devastating everything in its path. A man was kidnapped by Bigfoot and led to their lair, where he was forced to live 4 days in fear and terror. He had seen Bigfoot hunting game, tearing it apart with their sharp claws and teeth. When the Yeti were hungry, their behavior became even more violent. They began to scream, making outlandish and terrifying sounds, and blue glowing saliva flowed from their mouths. The man saw them devour their food with indomitable greed, as if unable to see anything around them except their agonizing hunger. He watched as the Yeti interacted with each other, making strange sounds and interacting with each other with unusual strength and brutality. He had witnessed their savage customs and the cruelty that reigned in their world. The news struck the villagers like lightning, leaving everyone who knew the missing family inconsolable and shocked. Grief and anger filled the hearts of everyone who loved and respected Andre, Marina, and their son. Luke was a renowned hunter in the village. He was also the best shoe repairman, and many villagers turned to him for help. Luke was a kind and humble man who was always willing to help others. One day, people came to Luke's door asking for their shoes to be repaired. But when they knocked on the door of his house, no one answered. They tried calling him through the window, but there was no answer there either. Despite his strange behavior, they decided to leave, thinking that Luke had just gone somewhere else for a while. A week went by, and Luke never made contact with anyone. This alarmed his neighbors and friends, who started looking for him all over the village. But when they found that his house was locked from inside and no one could get inside, they realized that something was wrong. The police were called to the scene, and when they were able to pry open the door, a horrible sight awaited them. The entire house was drenched in blue spit, and there were wisps of fur lying all over the floor. But the most shocking thing was the discovery on the ceiling: bullet holes. It turned out that Luke had managed to fire 2 shots at his attackers, but it looked like he hadn't hit. Bullets had pierced the ceiling, leaving deep marks of destruction. All of this indicated that the attackers were quite dangerous and ferocious. The police launched an investigation trying to find traces of the attackers. But despite all efforts, no clues were found, and the fate of Hunter Luke remained unknown. Everyone in the village was shocked by the event, and fear once again gripped the hearts of the villagers as they realized that the Bigfoot danger still threatened them. Carl was stunned and shocked at the horrible events taking place in the village. He could not believe that Bigfoot, which he had exclusively heard about in legends before, could be real creatures threatening his neighbors and friends. His heart was full of fear and anxiety for the safety of his loved ones and all the residents of the settlement. Carl began discussing everything with his family, pondering the possibility that 20 years ago, when he was searching for Bigfoot, he might have been on their trail. He questioned himself about the motives behind Bigfoot's attacks on people, whether it was them or something else. He analyzed every detail of what was happening, trying to understand and explain these mysterious events. Carl discussed his thoughts with his family, urging everyone to be vigilant and cautious. He warned of the dangers that may have lurked in the mountains and spoke of his experiences and research related to the search for Bigfoot. He shared his doubts and fears, hoping to understand and defeat the threat that was tripping them up. Carl rallied the community around him, evoking a general sense of responsibility and solidarity. He urged the residents to be attentive to their neighbors, to watch out for strange phenomena in the neighborhood, and not to leave anyone alone during the scary time. He was a support and encouragement to all who were stunned by the horrific events taking place in their community. Carl began holding conversations with the village sages and elders, discussing possible actions and strategies to defend against Bigfoot attacks. He sought support and advice from the experienced and wise, trying to find ways to peacefully coexist with the wild creatures that could threaten their lives. And so, during these difficult times, Carl remembered his journey in search of Bigfoot, his feelings and thoughts that haunted him. He realized then that he was close to the truth, and that perhaps the bears were just a distraction to cover up the true threat that threatened the village. Carl realized that he had to act quickly and decisively to protect his family and community from the Bigfoot menace. Carl began researching information about Bigfoot again with a new perspective. He read books dealing with the subject, studied old legends and tales of the outlandish creatures. He also reached out to locals, asking them about their perceptions of Bigfoot, listening to accounts of their encounters and views of these mysterious creatures. One of the most helpful sources of information was an old wise man from a neighboring village. He told Carl about the myths and legends associated with Bigfoot and gave him advice on how to behave if he encountered these creatures. He talked about their habits, how to understand and prevent their attacks, and how to maintain harmony with the natural environment. Carl also turned to books and scientific studies on wild creatures and their behavior. He learned that Bigfoot may not be as ferocious as they were described in legends, but they are still a danger to humans because of their size and strength. He learned about the characteristics and behavior of Bigfoot and how to evade or prevent their attacks. All of this knowledge and information helped Carl create a plan of action to protect his family and community from the dangers of Bigfoot. He began to educate his family and neighbors, sharing his knowledge and urging vigilance and caution. He suggested the creation of patrol groups to keep an eye on the safety of the settlement and organized training to defend against attacks. Slowly but surely, things began to change for the better. The residents of the settlement became more vigilant and cautious, watching out for each other and maintaining a general sense of safety. Carl became the leader of this initiative, organizing patrols and teaching people the basics of self-defense. A mother and daughter were walking home after a long day at school, discussing lessons and fun moments when suddenly a Yeti emerged from the snowy forest. His huge body was covered in dense fur, his sharp teeth gleamed in the sunset light, and his red eyes glittered with bloodlust. He slowly approached the women, heading straight for them. The mother and daughter were petrified with terror, not knowing what to do. Bigfoot approached them, his huge paws rising to grab the girl by the neck. The mother, realizing that time was running out for their imminent doom, grabbed her bag and began punching Bigfoot in the face. Screaming with rage and fright, Bigfoot began to drool blue saliva, his danger becoming more and more apparent. The mother kept hitting him with her bag, trying to scare him away from her daughter. But then something amazing happened. The Yeti, like a huge kangaroo, suddenly leapt 7 meters to the side, dodging the blows. The mother was stunned and terrified by this stunning maneuver. She screamed with fright, not knowing what to do next. The daughter, badly frightened and confused, looked at her mother with an expression of helplessness on her face. After this strange jump, Bigfoot stopped and looked at the women as if studying their reactions. The mother realized that they needed to escape from this dangerous situation immediately. She took her daughter's hand and began to run deeper into the forest, feeling fear and terror mixed with determination to survive. The Yeti seemed to stop without catching up with them. but their steps were filled with fear and anxiety, not knowing what might happen next. A strong wind met them along the way, the snow crunching under their feet, creating a tense environment. Mother and daughter ran, dodging trees and bushes, trying to conserve their strength and continue their journey to safety. Bigfoot was left behind, but fear and anxiety were still in their hearts, not leaving them until the very end. Finally, after a long and grueling race, they reached the village where they were greeted with relief and joy. The encounter with Bigfoot had left deep scars and traumas in them that were impossible to forget. The mother came to Carl, her eyes full of tears and fear. She told him about her encounter with Bigfoot, how they had barely managed to get away from him in the woods, and how she felt allowed and exhausted in front of this terrifying creature. Her voice trembled as she recounted how they had fled, fearing for their lives and the life of their daughter. Carl listened to his mother's every word, feeling her pain and fear. He was deeply moved by her story and at the same time felt anger and determination to defeat this threat. He hugged her and gave her an understanding look, trying to soothe and comfort her. "We will protect you, you and your daughter," Carl said, promising to do everything in his power to prevent more Bigfoot attacks. He vowed in his heart that he would not allow these dangerous creatures to harm anyone else, that he would be on guard and ready to lead the fight against them. The mother expressed great gratitude to Carl for his support and protection, for his willingness to stand up for all the villagers. She felt relieved knowing that they had such a strong and determined leader who was willing to fight for their safety. Thus began a new chapter in the life of Carl and the village, a chapter in the fight against the terrible Bigfoot threat. He became a pillar and leader in this fight, ready to face the danger and protect his loved ones and neighbors. His resolve was firm, his spirit was unshakable, and he was willing to do anything for the safety of his people. Carl remembered that conversation for the rest of his life. Upon returning home, I found my wife in tears. Her eyes were filled with fear and concern for the potential danger that lurked in the forest. She immediately realized that I had to go and deal with these Bigfoot and began to beg me not to go, fearing for my life. "Honey, I can't let you go. What if something happens to you? I'm afraid for you, for our family," she pleaded, hugging me tightly. I took her hands in mine and said, "Honey, I promise to protect our village, our neighbors, and our family. I can't just sit back and do nothing when our lives are threatened. I have an obligation to go and fight this threat. I have to try and protect all of us from these Yetis." In her eyes, I saw mixed feelings, fear, worry, but also understanding and support. After some thought and tears, she nodded to me and whispered, "Go protect us. I will pray for you. Come back safe and sound." My wife's words were like comfort and encouragement to me. I hugged her tightly, promising to return, and drew my weapon, ready to head into the woods and face this threat. I realized that I had a heavy task in front of me, but I was determined to defeat this threat for our safety and the safety of the entire village. Carl spent more than a week preparing for his long trek in search of Bigfoot. He practiced shooting, repeated trips on mountain trails, and studied maps and legends about the whereabouts of these creatures. His days were filled with various types of training and preparation to be ready for any challenges that might await him in the mountains. Carl thought about his family, his loved ones, and the fate of the village. He felt responsible for their safety and was willing to do anything to protect them. A fire of determination and perseverance burned in his heart to help him overcome any challenges and obstacles in his path. In his thoughts, he considered the various scenarios that could play out during an encounter with Bigfoot. He prepared himself for possible situations by developing plans of action and strategies to defend himself against an attack from a wild creature. He was focused on his goal and was determined to go through all the trials to succeed in his mission. On his long trek in search of Bigfoot, Carl took along his most essential survival gear and items. He carried his trusty shotgun with enough ammunition to be ready for any danger. He also took along a medical kit with the necessary medications and first aid kit to be ready to administer first aid if needed. Carl also took along special warm clothing to protect himself from the cold and wind in the mountains, as well as a sleeping bag and tent to be able to spend the night away from the settlement. He took a few days' worth of food with him to ensure that he would be adequately fed for the duration of the trek. In the morning, as the sun was rising, Carl kissed his wife and said his parting words to her. He hugged her tightly, feeling her warmth and support that he needed so badly in this trying hour. His wife smiled at him and wished him success, promising to pray for his well-being. Carl stepped out of the house and looked at his village, seeing the tranquility and peace he had to protect. He headed towards the forest, feeling the eyes of his neighbors looking at him with hope and faith in his strength and determination. Carl entered the forest, smelling the freshness and wildlife around him. He walked with confidence and purpose, knowing that he had much in front of him, but ready to go through every challenge to protect those he loved and respected. For 2 days, Carl continued his trek in search of Bigfoot. He walked through the mountain trails and forests, scrutinizing the surrounding area and looking for any signs or traces of wild creatures. He spent his days carefully studying the surrounding area, listening to the sounds of nature and following his intuition, trying to find a place where Bigfoot might have lived. But despite his best efforts, he found no traces or signs of Bigfoot. He continued on his journey, trying to be careful and cautious, ready for any possible dangers that may have befallen him. He walked day after day, hoping to find any clues or evidence of Bigfoot in the area. After 2 days, Carl decided to camp in a snowy clearing deep in the forest. He chose a safe place, hidden from prying eyes, where he could rest and prepare for the next stage of his journey. He built a fire, cooked a meal, and sat down pondering his next steps. At this distant time, Carl did not yet realize that he was about to encounter Bigfoot. His decision to set traps around the camp arose as a precaution, to be ready for any possible threats of nature that might have befallen him. Carl set the traps with care and professionalism, knowing that his life and safety could depend on it. One of the traps was a baby doll that looked like a little girl. Carl confidently set it up in a prominent place, hoping to attract the attention of a curious or aggressive Bigfoot. He knew that many wild creatures were attracted to such objects, so using the doll as bait was a logical step for him. After all the traps were set, Carl sat down by the fire, keeping a close eye on his surroundings and ready for any eventuality. His heart beat hard in anticipation. His thoughts focused on protecting himself and all those who were threatened by the Yeti. He didn't know what to expect, but was determined to deal with this threat, whatever it might be. Night fell and Carl's camp was silent. The fire slowly smoldered, illuminating the surrounding area and creating a cozy atmosphere in the darkness of the forest. Carl sat by the fire, keeping a tense eye on his surroundings, ready for any possible danger. After a few hours of vigilant watching, fatigue began to take over Carl, and he realized that his strength was leaving him. His eyelids grew heavy, his thoughts became blurry, and his consciousness began to float into the dream world. He tried to fight sleep, but the fatigue was too strong, and he finally succumbed to it. Carl awoke to the sound of a trap being earned and jumped to his feet. His heart was beating harder, and his thoughts were flying in different directions, trying to figure out what had happened. He quickly ran up to the trap with the girl and saw that the trap had been triggered. His gaze fell on the puddle of blue blood that was left where the doll had previously stood. The gruesome sight stunned Carl. He realized that Bigfoot had infiltrated his camp and had fallen into the trap. His heart hammered even harder, realizing that this was not just a creature, but a dangerous and ferocious threat to everyone in the forest. Carl felt a mixed feeling of fear, terror, and determination to defeat this threat. He slowly approached the scene, peering into the surrounding terrain, looking for signs of Bigfoot. He saw tracks leading deeper into the forest, and his protective instincts took over. He decided to follow those footprints and try to deal with this horror that had infiltrated their world. Carl's heart beat hard as he followed the Bigfoot's footsteps. His mind was filled with determination and willingness to fight this dangerous creature. He felt this was a crucial moment where he had to protect his family, his neighbors, and the entire village from this threat. Carl followed the Bigfoot's tracks all night, following them through backwoods and snowy glades. He was determined and ready to fight this dangerous creature to protect his community. But as the hours passed, Bigfoot's footprints disappeared again and again, as if the creature knew how to hide its presence. Carl felt fatigue begin to take over, but he wasn't going to stop. He kept moving forward, following his intuition and the hope that he would find Bigfoot and end this threat. His heart beat hard, filled with fear and determination. Finally, morning came, and Carl realized that he would have to return to camp without any results. But he knew he was not going to give up. He returned to his camp, ready to continue his search and fight the Bigfoot threat for however long it took. Each day, Carl continued his search, surveying the surrounding area and looking for signs of this dangerous creature. He didn't know how long it would take him to find Bigfoot, but he was determined to do everything he could to protect his loved ones and his community from this threat. A week had passed, but the Bigfoot tracks were still unclear and confusing. Carl felt his strength draining, but he wasn't going to give up. He continued his search, hoping to find this dangerous creature and defeat it. Suddenly, Carl's head was hit and he lost consciousness. When he opened his eyes, he found himself bound in a cage. There were 3 Yetis standing around him, 2 of them huge and 1 smaller. They were terrifying looking, with sharp fangs, fur covered with snow and mud, and their eyes full of malice and cruelty. One of the huge Yeti was wounded and was sniffling in pain. His fur was covered in blood and his eyes were looking for revenge. The other huge Yeti was even bigger and even more intimidating. His fangs were long and sharp, his fur was as dark as night, and his eyes glittered with anger and aggression. The third, smaller one, was a slender and flexible figure, but his gaze was also full of menace and danger. The Yeti were surrounded by a stinking atmosphere. They made low growling sounds. Their breathing was heavy and unpredictable. Carl felt terror sweep over him. He realized that he was in for a hard fight with these creatures that brought death and destruction wherever they went. He cursed himself for his absent-mindedness and carelessness that had led him into this death trap. The Yeti approached him, beginning to look at him and sniff him. They made strange hissing noises that sent shivers down Carl's spine. He felt their eyes on him, their fangs ready to tear him apart. He realized that death was near and that he would have to fight for his life. Carl felt fear and hopelessness, but at the same time he internally prepared himself for this fight. He knew that he had to keep fighting, that he had to show the Yeti that he was not such easy prey. He looked at them with a certain determination, ready to fight to his last breath. At that moment, one of the Yeti approached the cage, their gazes meeting. Carl saw in his eyes not only aggression, but something else, something he couldn't understand. The Yeti began hissing even harder, trying to intimidate him, but Carl remained undeterred. He closed his hand on the smooth stone knife that lay at the bottom of the cage, ready to defend himself if the Yeti decided to attack him. The tension in the air became palpable. Everything was on edge. Carl knew that danger was near, that his life hung in the balance. Carl was stunned by the horrifying sight before him. The wounded Yeti chewed off his own wounded arm, making shrill screaming and hissing noises. Blood rushed from the wound, staining the cage bright blue. Carl could feel his own hand shaking with terror as he watched this insane scene. The wounded Yeti continued to gnaw off his arm despite the pain and blood, his eyes full of agony and madness. Carl was stunned by what he saw. He couldn't believe that such a scene was unfolding right before his eyes. His own screams and those of the Yeti filled the cage, making the setting even more apocalyptic. The second Yeti approached the wounded man with his herb and liquid. He wrapped his fellow man's wounded arm, trying to render aid. Carl could see the blue liquid oozing from the Yeti's wound as grass quickly bandaged the injured limb. The sight remained as terrifying as the Bigfoot's terrifying behavior. The wounded Yeti's hand lay on the floor of the cage, covered in blood and flesh. Every movement of the Yeti, every scream and moan pierced Carl's heart, filling him with despair and fear. He realized that he was in mortal danger and that his fight for survival was just beginning. He felt that his fate would be decided here and now in a cage with these dangerous and aggressive creatures. 2 days passed slowly, and Carl began to realize that the Yetis were not going to return. He dared to hope that he could escape this cage and return to his community. Carl began to look around the cage, searching for a weak spot or a way out. He found that one of the bars of the cage was weaker than the others. He began to push gently, trying to create a gap large enough for him to fit through. With each passing hour, Carl's thrusts grew stronger, and finally the bar snapped, creating an opening large enough for Carl to fit through. He released himself from the cage, feeling the freedom of stiff muscles and stiff limbs. Carl cautiously stepped out of the cave he was held in, looking around to make sure none of the Yeti could see his escape. He realized He had to act quickly and carefully to get out of the Bigfoot camp and back to his community. Carl moved through the forest, carefully crossing glades and overcoming obstacles in his path. He listened to every rustle and rustle for signs of Bigfoot, ready for an unexpected encounter. After 2 days of wandering through the woods and fighting for survival, Carl finally came to the clearing where he had left his camp. There was a strange feeling in his heart, joy at being able to escape the Bigfoot's clutches, and anxiety for his community that was left without his protection. Carl approached his broken camp and saw that the Yeti had left it untouched. He found that his food supplies had been left in a place and his sleeping bag lay intact and untouched. He dined on the food left behind and decided to stay in his camp to get some rest and recuperate after all his experiences. After supper, Carl settled into his sleeping bag, leaning against his sack of clothes and closing his eyes to get some rest. He heard the rustle of the forest around him, listened to the singing of the birds and the murmur of the stream, and felt fatigue take possession of his body. Finally, in his brain translated correctly, the sleeping warrior weakened. He soon fell asleep, falling into a dream world where he saw himself fighting Bigfoot and protecting his community from danger. His sleep was filled with battles and dreams of defeating the terrible creature that threatened his home and loved ones. Despite his fatigue, Carl slept peacefully and quietly, feeling that he had done everything he could to protect his community. His heart was at peace, knowing that he was ready to continue his fight against Bigfoot no matter how long it took him. Waking up the next morning, Carl felt refreshed and determined. He made himself a breakfast of leftover food. Carl struggled to get back to his camp, his heart full of mixed feelings. He was glad that he had managed to escape the Bigfoot's clutches and return to his community, but he was simultaneously exhausted and anxious for his loved ones. As he approached his camp, his heart beat faster, and when he saw his wife rushing to him and hugging him, he felt relief and joy. His wife began to cry, hugging him tightly and saying that she was afraid he would never come back. Carl comforted her by hugging and reassuring her, telling her about his adventures in fighting Bigfoot. His wife was shocked, but also proud of his courage and determination. She thanked the gods that he had returned safe and sound. Carl told everyone in the village about his Bigfoot adventure and how he had fought these dangerous creatures to protect his community. People were shocked and surprised by Carl's story, but they were also grateful for his bravery and dedication. Everyone listened to his words with attention and respect, realizing that he had done something incredible. After Carl's story, everyone in the village was shocked and excited. They thanked him for his bravery and loyalty and feared for their lives and safety. They were grateful to him for protecting them from the Bigfoot threat, while also feeling fear and anxiety about these dangerous creatures. Carl became a hero to his community. His story passed by word of mouth, and his name became a symbol of courage and dedication. The people in the village looked at him with admiration and respect, realizing that he was willing to go to any lengths to protect them from danger. The village elders gathered together to discuss the situation with Bigfoot and the cave he inhabits. Carl tried to dissuade them from this dangerous and unwise idea, warning them of the possible dangers and risks. He told them the horror he had witnessed of Bigfoot and the trials he had gone through to escape. However, the elders were persistent and determined. They made sure to write down all the stories and legends about Bigfoot to preserve the history for future generations. The elders decided to go to the cave to gather evidence and proof of Bigfoot's existence. Thus, the group of elders and Carl traveled to the cave in search of new discoveries and knowledge. When they finally reached the Bigfoot cave, their hearts hammered harder, their gazes intense and wary. They armed themselves and prepared for any resistance they encountered. It was dangerous to enter this cave, but the elders were determined. Carl took over driving the group, guiding them inward and drowning out their own fears. As they approached the cave, the elders were shocked at the horrible sight that opened before their eyes. Inside the cave was a huge pile of coals with a dead Yeti lying amongst them. They saw the place where Carl had been held captive, his sleeping bag and the remains of his food. The elders were shocked by what they saw, their hearts hammering harder with terror. They frantically gathered all the clues and evidence to present to the community and share information about Bigfoot's existence. Every step was surrounded by fear and anxiety, but they kept moving forward, lighting up the cave and gathering clues. Finally, having gathered all the evidence and proof they needed, the elders and Carl headed home, loaded with thoughts of their adventure. All along the way, their conversations were filled with wonder and shock as they discussed every detail of their journey and the events that had occurred in the cave. When they returned to the village, all the villagers were amazed by the story of the elders. They frantically heeded every word, horrified and delighted at the same time. In this way, the recent events in the village left their mark on the hearts of all the villagers, showing that the true soul of heroism and loyalty can show itself in the most difficult situations. And the story of the battle with Bigfoot became a legend, inspiring everyone to exploits and courage.